And stay tuned for I think three more at least in the next year. This one's entitled "Carrying Your Part of the Sky: What Artists Do in Perilous Times." And I would like to introduce Tom Healy, who is the host and moderator. He is a writer and a poet, an activist, and a curator, among many other things. And I will leave it to him to introduce the rest of the panel members. But I do want to remind you that their books are for sale in the lobby after, and I'm sure they're willing to sign the books to anyone who's interested. And thank you to the Knight Foundation, who supports this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me, guys? Oh, good. Thank you, Kylie, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Edwidge just pointed out to me the people who didn't show up are the ones with reserved seats. So if you want to come closer, please do. There's plenty of room up front. We'd love you to be up front. And I guess they think I talk too much because for the first time, you can't see it, but we have a big red countdown clock here now. So what we're going to do is have a conversation for about 45 minutes and then have a bigger conversation with questions from you all as well. So thank you, and let me introduce Frances Negrón-Muntaner and Edwidge Danticat, two extraordinary people, both writers, both have worked in film, and Frances is a scholar and professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, and Edwidge, who has written more books than I can count, has won a MacArthur Genius Award, the National Book Award, has a brilliant new book of stories out, and that I hope you'll read and that we'll enjoy talking about some. So thank you both for coming. Thank you. One of the things I wanted to talk about today was joy and catastrophe. It's a conversation Frances and I have been having a little bit about, and I don't know what you guys were doing with your Sunday afternoon, but I was doing homework because Frances sent me a paper she's written on kind of the philosophy and politics of joy, and I spent my afternoon reading about that. Maybe you could start us off, Frances, a little bit in talking about what that issue is and how it's come up in the work you're doing.
Well, I think I wouldn't have become a theorist of joy if Puerto Rico had not gone through such catastrophes over the last decade. So what happened when it was declared by the governor of Puerto Rico that Puerto Rico had an unpayable debt, I organized a working group at Columbia University to study what was going on, how did that happen. And after 3 years of that process, we decided to create a project, but we didn't want to do the usual thing that emerges from an academic working group, which would have been a collection of essays, academic essays. We wanted to engage the public, so we created this project called Valor y Cambio, Value and Change, which is a public art installation where we got an ATM, emptied it out, put a recorder, put a microphone, and created a community currency. And the idea was to create an experience for participants in which everything that happened in the project happened through exchanges to illuminate the possibility of an economy that wasn't based on extraction and profit. So in exchange of the story that you told us about value, the machine gave you one of the community currencies randomly. Then you could exchange that with any of the participating organizations or vendors. And therefore, we got everything we wanted without exchanging a single dollar, right? The joy came with the response that people had to the project, which, on one hand, I didn't feel estranged from it because I had felt tremendous joy working on that project. But when I saw people getting their bills and they would cry, or they would be just so happy to get that bill, and they would stand in line for hours and hours, even when it rained, to get that bill, I started asking people, why, what's going on? And that's how I understood that the joy that people felt was directly correlated to the suffering that we were going through, which to me had three vectors. One was the austerity crisis, One was Hurricane Maria and its aftermath, and the other one was the mass migration that the hurricane and the crisis had produced. Mm-hmm. That's how I got to joy through all that.
Edwidge, just before I read this new book of stories, I actually read this small, beautiful book you wrote on dying, which is an extraordinary book of essays that, in some ways, the occasion of is the death of your mother, and but it's both about your own way of writing about death, but also how many other writers have done so. And in that book, it seems as if the same kind of issue, the catastrophe of the death and that loss, also gets talked about as a kind of occasion for thinking about living and the joys in that. And could you talk about that a little and what that experience was?
First of all, I have this mic and not the other one because I don't have a pocket.
Just because you're cooler.
And I'm in the middle, that's probably.
Yes.
Well, actually, every time I write about death, or even in scenes in a dramatic way, I often have this image in my mind of being, when I was a girl, of going to wakes in Haiti. And it was often, the night before of the funeral, and sometimes if it's in the countryside, the body was even in the house. And when I was little, I was so perplexed by that there was this glorious, lively celebration right before, the death, and then so the next day, the people would be, they would be throwing themselves on the ground, they would be performing all these rituals, these body rituals of death, but the night before, everybody was so joyful. So for me, the two, the joy that follows tragedy, that precedes tragedy, or that goes along with it, was always part of my notion of death. And I think, coming from a place like Haiti, where people often just because you have to, right? And I think you have to kind of be aware that it's not like this thing of here that people have the pursuit of happiness, happiness is your right. It's it's kind of it's more like the Buddhist thing, life is suffering. So all those things are working together, which is why it's so demonstrated in the art, the visual art. It's sort of those things work together. My mother, who inspired that book, used to say that we're all walking with our coffins under our arms, it's sort of in the midst of life is death. And so, of course, there's a window of joy in that. And how do you, you can't have the fullness of life without some suffering, but you also can't have death without having had life. So that for me was what I was attempting to capture in that book.
And I think one of the things you both talk about this, about Puerto Rican culture and about Haitian culture, and I've certainly seen it many times. I've been there. The dead don't leave in lots of ways. Very much unlike the kind of modern Western distancing of death from our lives and kind of anesthetizing of culture. There's this sense of the dead being all around. And I remember after the earthquake, one of the most painful things was the inability to put dead people in mausoleums or coffins, or to identify many of the bodies with families, that there was this sense of the dead not with their families, which was, a situation that happened in Puerto Rico, is happening now in the Bahamas. And I guess my question is that when we have these kinds of catastrophes, as artists and writers, you're often asked to have something to say about them. And you've written about this even in kind of Living Dangerously after the earthquake. There's horrible things that happened. You've written very beautifully and painfully about that. But people kind of put an expectation on you of what they expect you to say or do about that. And how have you dealt with that expectation?
Frances has beautifully
Sure.
dealt with it.
Well, I think scholars and artists are often asked, you write letters, you write op-eds, you know, you try to provide a voice in that context. But one of the things that I really thought a lot about in the aftermath of Maria, and I'm glad Alexandra is here because it was partly inspired by her work, is to look at catastrophe very differently than I was looking at it. And also to think about, there's an equivalence in the Puerto Rican aftermath of Maria between disaster and catastrophe as something inherently negative. In other words, it's just traumatic. But I started to rethink the catastrophe as overturning, a moment where there's still a sense of discernment and something that it's a new beginning, which also has to do with death, death bringing new beginnings. And in that sense, I think the painful part of it is that catastrophe comes with a tremendous amount of pain. So in the case of Puerto Rico, part of the way to narrate that pain is about at least nearly 5,000 people officially died, maybe more. So this discernment that is possible at moments of catastrophe come with a lot of pain. Yet it seems that we're increasingly in catastrophic times. So how we think about catastrophe and how we angle ourselves, I think is becoming very, very crucial. And in that sense, I think that the project that I worked on, Valor y Cambio, was a departure from past things I've done in moments of catastrophe, because it was not so much pushing back or criticizing, it was creating collectively, telling a story together. And that was very different type of work than I had done before, which was trying to leverage whatever resources or visibility you have in a sphere of power. So in this case, it was not about that. It was about creating together a space for something else to happen.
And I completely understand. I think as a person who is also listening in the middle of some tragedy, that desire to look to a seer or look to someone who knows a little bit to say, tell me what to think or tell me what to do. So it's not, I think it's an honor, and then there are moments where you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say, but I remember, I was since that anniversary just happened, I was in New York on September 11, 2001, and I remember thinking, I was like, I wonder what Toni Morrison will say about that. And then, and she wrote something in the New Yorker where she said something like how it was still new, and she was like, how do I speak to this? And then she addressed her remarks to the dead. And she said, how do we speak about you with a mouthful of blood? And all of that the weight of all that meant, in terms of not just mourning, but responsibility. So I think in those moments, it's also, it feels intimidating to also, because you're suddenly speaking about, I think as a scholar, you're sort of given more room, but as someone who's just like, you've written just novels, and then suddenly people who did not elect you, you're supposed to be speaking for them. So I think there's a little bit of tension in that where you can, and you're speaking to a communal grief in the way that we all are. But I think there are these moments where they're like, well, why this one? Why? And you're never saying the fullness of everything. So it's also important, like what I do in those moments, I was like, okay, you need an economist, I know a great one. You need a historian, I know a great one. To also kind of, I think it's important to have a multiplicity of voices in those moments, so you're like not the only one that keeps showing up.
So one thing I'd say that one of the things that impressed me about the post-hurricane juncture in Puerto Rico was that I don't think the getting 1 million people on the street would have been possible without that work of threading a new story, which was not only done by academics or artists, it was done by people who directly were affected. So you would have voices from nurses, from doctors, from students, from someone who lost a home or a relative. I think that that mobilization was made possible by that threading of a story that was from multiple perspectives, but that was able to successfully pinpoint why are we suffering so, and I think it depended much less on a voice or a leader or someone who is all-seeing, then trusting and sharing our stories with each other so we can pull together a perspective of what's going on.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, I did my homework and read up about Catastrophe, and it really did mean early in Greek drama about this turning over and not the end of things. That's sort of the 18th century sense of it. So in this moment, you're there, there's this communal currency, an ATM machine, FedEx from New York to markets in Puerto Rico, and you talk about being there and trying to describe what this will be and how we'll create this this currency of exchange and participation. And you explained that the business people at the farmers market got the sense of like, oh, we'll be losing money and wasting time.
Right.
Let's go for it. We're in. So what was that? Like, why did that sense of, you're in a market, these people were
Right.
generally selling things, and they were very radically open to thinking differently.
Well, I think there were a couple of things. One, our pitch was accept this community currency, which is a type of money that people can create to meet their own exchange, but for this art project. It's not a real community currency, it's for the art project. And the pitch was basically, yes, accept this for 8 days, during which you will potentially lose money and waste your time. And people said yes. In fact, 42 businesses said yes to that. And the reason, I think, is that, as one farmer in the farmer's market in Old San Juan put it, is because the community currency gave us hope. It gave us hope of another economy. It gave us hope for another world that we want to live in. And that's why that's the leap of faith. And of course, what happened is that because hundreds of people went to their businesses, they actually didn't lose any money or waste any time. But that's not something we knew at the beginning. Now, when we moved to New York, that's a whole different conversation. And I think one of the interesting things in Puerto Rico was that I would say that it took me about a minute or less to explain to a woman in Puerto Rico what a just economy was, or why it was appealing. It took me much longer to convince men of that in Puerto Rico, but it takes the average New Yorker about 20, 25 minutes to wrap their head around a different economy that could be not based on extraction and profit. So once we moved the project to New York, we're in a totally different environment. And I think one of the conclusions, I don't want to reach conclusions yet, but something I've been thinking is that it's not that people in New York don't have their own challenges and sufferings, but I think they don't recognize it in some ways. And I think in the Puerto Rico context, it's inevitable. You have to face it, or you've been made to face it. It's so harsh. But in New York, it's a different experience altogether. And in fact, I can tell you by the response that people have to getting the currency, if they're from Puerto Rico or they're from somewhere else.
I wanted to stay with that notion of the back and forth and sort of the travel. They're both Puerto Rican expressions and Haitian Creole expressions for that sense of movement across the water, jumping the pond, and one thing that you've written very eloquently about, Edwidge, is Zora Neale Hurston's question of travel dust and that sense of having different audiences, being in different places, being sometimes an observer and sometimes part of it, and you've written about that idea of a writer or an artist getting a passport into the country, sort of the emotional, imaginative country of their readers. And I'm curious about that sense of transport and movement between places and cultures and audiences for you.
Well, I think the clearest most liberating version of that I saw was the Haitian writer Danny Laferrière, who he said, I'm so tired of this question. People kept asking me, are you a Haitian writer? Are you a Caribbean writer? Are you a Canadian writer? Because he's from Canada. And then he just said, he started answering, I'm a Japanese writer. And people were confused. He said, well, I become a citizen of the country when a Japanese reader reads me, I become a Japanese writer. And he said, well, when I was younger, in Haiti, I was reading Shakespeare, I was reading Chaucer, I was reading Zola in Haiti, and there were Haitian writers, because otherwise, what were they doing in my room? So this idea was like he repatriated the writers that he was reading in a way that during the dictatorship was so important to us too, because our writers were getting killed by the dictatorship. And so many of them, there's one writer actually who lived here, who died here, Félix Maurice Leroy. What he did during the dictatorship, he rewrote Antigone in Creole. And he did it in response to the fact that, for example, when people's loved ones were killed, they couldn't take them out of the street, and which is part of the plot of this play. And so they would put on this play, and the people who were affected by it would understand. So he was repatriating this character, he was repatriating this play. So I think the circumstances were making it, forceful. But I also like this notion of of the words. There's a Creole proverb, parole gen pied, parole gen zèle. Words have wings, words have feet. And I like the idea of the work making its own way, outside of all these parallels. And we have also in our history examples of people hiding words, burying words, and so once it's out of my hands, I feel like once I'm done what I've done, I mean, it's like for all art, it just travels its own path, and it just, and we end up here having conversations like this.
So part of that traveling, when I came here this afternoon, I took an Uber to get here because I didn't know if there'd be parking either. But the driver, she is Dominican and Jamaican, and she background, and she said, "Why are you going to a museum on a Sunday afternoon?" I said, "I'm going to have this talk with these two great artists." And she said, she asked who, and she said, to tell Edwidge I'm one of her readers, and she started quoting to me from Zora Neale Hurston and from Maya Angelou, and she said to me, tell her to say something in memory of Toni Morrison. So could you talk a little bit about Toni for Renee,
what was her name?
Beautiful.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like I have been saying things about Toni Morrison since she died, but she was a very important writer to me. But the first thing of hers I read is an essay on the rootedness of ancestors, and she talked about in that essay how we write as Black writers in the presence of ancestors, and so she's an ancestor now, and she'll always be with me. That's probably the shortest thing I can say without crying.
Yeah. Yes,
I like to say something about traveling. Like, our currency is in Spanish. Like, every piece of writing in it is in Spanish. So one of the things is we printed it in Spanish and we took it to New York. Half of the people that have participated in our project don't read Spanish. It doesn't matter to them. I've asked them. And one of the most interesting things are a group of kids that come to our project, and they don't read Spanish, most of them. And I had the opportunity of asking them, why do kids love this project so much? And what they said to me was, kids don't get money. And this is something we've earned, and now we can dispose of as we see fit, right? So what was important to them, what traveled, weren't so much the words in that case, or even the specific stories in that particular case. It was what the project allowed them to affirm. They allowed children to affirm their value to an economy, right? And in another group of 12-year-old girls that came, mostly African-American from the Lower East Side, they also weren't that interested in the specifics of the stories, but once we talked a little bit more about it, and I asked them, well, what would be the value of this project that was so rooted in Puerto Rico to you? And what they told me was, we should know more about Puerto Ricans who are all around us. So in those instances, it seems that communication is happening at so many different ways, and that it's really the relationship that whether a reader or a participant establishes with that carries the day, and what you make of it. Not necessarily even your own intention.
I was struck by one thing you write about. Talk to me about when you ask that question, when people go to tell their stories, they're in front of this ATM and they're allowed to. Part of it is asking what are the things that they do value. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the struggle various groups of people had in identifying some that. Could you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Well, the biggest struggle wasn't so much in the question of what do you value, it's the third question that people struggle the most, which is what person or organization already supports what you value. Most people cannot identify other like-minded people. And that's one of the reasons we created the project, to create a platform that people can connect to each other, which is what happened when people were in the line and happened when we all talked to each other. And also when people wanted to trade bills, it's like, I want that bill, and can you take this bill? So people talked to each other and broke down the barriers that could be there. So I would say that's that was the question, and that's a very as a result of the project, that's something that's very challenging, because if people don't know other people that they could connect to, then it's very difficult to implement what you value in a public space. But people didn't have that much. Some people did cry coming out of the experience because when they had never thought about it. So when they had to say it out loud, they might have told a story that was painful. Like a lot of people cried when they spoke and said, what I most value is my mother. And then when you say your story, a lot of those stories were about, if it wasn't for my mother, I wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for the sacrifices that she made. And some people would cry at telling that story. And I talked to someone that cried because he said he realized he was a bad person. Answering he said, I don't do anything for anybody, and I hadn't realized that until somebody asked me, what do you value? So it was more about, it was like kind of intense conversation that you're kind of having with yourself, because the machine, some people treated the machine as a priest. Like you're a confessional, you're telling them things that you've never told anyone, actually. So I would say that's more where the intensity of it was in the process.
Mm-hmm. So Edwidge, in this question of value, one of the things that you talk about from Toni Morrison is in her famous Nobel Prize speech, and this paradox of being an immigrant writer or having universality, or this notion of where one fits. And you say, if I could just read this, the immigrant artist, to borrow from Toni Morrison's lecture, knows how to, quote, live at the edge of towns that cannot bear our company, hamlets that need our labor but want our children banned from their schools, villages that want our sick shut out from their hospitals, big cities that want our elderly, after a lifetime of impossible labor, to pack up and go off somewhere else to die. That value of speaking on those margins for those voices, and that's a deeply powerful question. It's part of the impetus of why I wanted us to talk today, because there are always these sense of people who are pushed to the margins, and we're seemingly at a time in our own culture in America of a lot of aggressive attempts to define and push people to the margins. And does that experience change, or has that been the core of a sense of how you've written and how you approach your storytelling?
Well, I keep thinking about those lines of, in the Nobel lecture, she was writing about racism and just like leaving, like that part that I quoted, that you quoted, from the living on the edges of towns that cannot bear our company, and then I sort of filled in the rest. Yeah. And that feels, that is, of course, so much truer than ever. I've lived in this community since 2002, and I had never seen an ICE van, one of those, until the last 2 years. I've had, my own family has, I've had a very tragic experience with my uncle who was detained in immigration. He had his meditation taken away, was brought to Chrome and died shackled to a bed in a hospital, the county hospital here at 81 years old. I had that personal experience, but it feels like communally, the margins are so much bigger, and the fear is so much deeper. And so I think in the way that it's sort of like the witnessing becomes larger, like that job of trying to tell those stories or trying to join the voices of other people who are telling those stories. And now it feels more than just oh, I want to write about this, but it's oh, this can actually help somebody, and that part of it feels, much more necessary. For example, there was a young man we knew who was a family friend, was the valedictorian at his school, and was supposed to go to a great college, got a full ride, but then he was a TPS recipient and could not, and suddenly couldn't get the papers. And that's a real example. And then knowing also that he's one of thousands, and so how do you tell that story in some ways? Do you wait to make a character in fiction? Do you write an op-ed? Do you write a story? So that part of it, I think, from the margins, that seems more necessary to kind of jump in there and drag those stories from the margins.
One of the things that happens in your stories so beautifully and in this new book is you tell those stories, but nobody gets off the hook. They're the truth of how complex we all are, and there are people who do very bad things to the people they love, just as in real life. And I'm curious about that sense of why, because to me this is why art works so much better often than certain kinds of discourse in politics and such, because there can be good groups and bad groups and kind of a clear moral agenda. In these stories, people are deeply complicated. They have their personal needs and demons, they have communal goals, they have love and hate and all those things together. And I think you've seen this too, Frances, in how you talk about how complicated these sets of values that people even bring to creating a shared currency and a community currency, that they may be different kinds of joys, different needs that come together. So, but that's not how our political discourse goes. Our political discourse doesn't live in complication like that. And so you're very active in kind of working to create direct political change. How do we keep that rich complexity and often paradox of what real life is when there still are big, important questions of social justice and the rightness and wrongness of certain kinds of policies? And
one of the things that I spent some time thinking about is there were a number of articles in the aftermath of the Puerto Rican mobilizations in the US press saying, well, in our political context, the president has said equally bad or worse things to the population than the governor of Puerto Rico did in the chats, yet there's not millions of Americans on the street. Why is that? So why is that? And I think one of the reasons that it's not occurring is that the number of people on the margins is a lot. It's most of us. Yet there are such deep divisions in pointing what is that source of suffering between those pushed to the margins, that it's very difficult to conceive that type of response in the United States. In other words, if you are attributing immigrants as the cause of your suffering, or the racial other, or members of the LGBTQ community, or what have you, then that space is extremely fraught. So the margins are not just going to come together, because the ways that each group is narrating what is happening and making sense of it is actually not conducive to that. In the piece that you did your homework today in the afternoon, I start sketching in the context of this project, what could be a way that those differently articulated joys can come together. And I think Audre Lorde gave a way in, which is that we share our joys. They may be different perspectives, coming from different places, but perhaps we can share what is it that makes us joyful. And of course, that's not going to apply to all groups, because there are destructive joys, as well as the colonial and other types of joys. But those on the joyful side. I think one bridge to that is being able to share, and that's why I put so much attention in the work that I'm doing now and in the future work, to creating the spaces for that sharing, exchange, and connection to take place. Without that, definitely we're going to be in an extremely fragmented space where it's very easy to take advantage of. A small group marginalizing a very big group that, however, is in turmoil.
And I think one of the ways also of keeping the margins apart is in the distribution of resources,
Sure.
right? So that people always feel like, oh, they're getting much more than I am. And I think that's also part where the national discourse is going. Like, okay, you have these problems because there are these people coming here. And so, and there are times when there's even rational people you've known, no, it's kind of right. And they start, looking at it in a certain way. But it's sort of like limiting the resources that are available, and just like letting people hate each other over it is also, I think, it's part of the how it's going these days. For example, this law that's going into effect where people can't get services, like if you want a green card, you can't take your kid to the ER if he's sick, you can't do these things. And then, and they're perfectly rational people who are, who might be saying, oh yeah, more for me. So that happens too.
But to me, that's also a very narrative problem, because sometimes equity and equality are not the same thing. So, like, for instance, some people need more of some things than other people, yet if you read that as inequality or as injustice, then that narrative is going to lead you to certain conclusions than if you narrate that in a different way. And part of the narrative challenge is who's participating in producing the narrative. And if you don't participate and you are a consumer of a narrative, then that's part of the cost or part of the risk of that.
That's a good moment for that question of who's participating, to open it up for people in the audience to ask some questions and participate in this with us. So, Kylie, you have the mic. So if you raise your hand and she'll come around, please feel free.
Now I'm going to ask you guys questions.
Thank you. Very illuminating. Sometimes when I look at tragedy, I try to get a large historical perspective. I look at World War I, the Battle of the Somme, Verdun, ouch, people dead, Civil War, Crusades. Our history is rich with tragic examples. John F. Kennedy, when he passed, tragedy was just one person, but the impact was as if it was lots of people. So today, now we live in different times where standard of living is, we live in some of the most peaceful, most prosperous times the world has ever seen. And so how one looks at tragedy, impact, comparatively to, say, the tragedy and impact of days gone by, how do you think things differ, how the narrative of tragedy differs now than the narrative of, say, tragedy that was common day for, say, a generation ago?
You want to talk about? I mean, I didn't write about tragedy, so about catastrophe.
I want to say before you go.
No,
like,
no, you go.
Peaceful and prosperous for whom?
Right.
Right. I think we have to also start there. I think there are millions and millions of people around the world who would disagree that these are the most peaceful and prosperous times.
Well, yeah, I mean, to that, it's a hypothesis. It's a debate, and there are people saying, posing that position. In other work that I've done, like I've done some work on Vieques Island in Puerto Rico, which was a place where the U.S. Military bombarded for decades, and to practice, right? And one of the things that I was thinking during that process is that if you count the number of dead, let's say, compared to World War I, then you could say, yes, if you measure it in that type of casualty, certainly there are fewer casualties of that kind than before, but perhaps the deaths are masked in some ways. So it's people in communities that are being bombarded with the same chemicals that are dying of cancer. It's a long death, so it's not dying on the battlefield, but they may be dying. We are living in a moment, to follow up on the Edwidge comment, where inequality, it's in some contexts, it's about the worst that's ever been in history, right? So we're actually living in a moment where there's an issue of distribution, like where is the prosperity versus where it isn't. But also is that what used to look a certain way now may look a little different. So what may have looked like hundreds of thousands of bodies on a battlefield now is distributed differently. Casualties of civilians in another country, which are really not felt or counted in the country that's sending the soldiers, and so forth. So I think what I would say in short would then be that we need a global perspective and integrate that global perspective to be able to discern better how is it that violence is working today, which might look a bit different from other eras. And it might be affecting other areas, and not only other areas geographically, but other areas of our everyday life. So for instance, I think a lot about food in the US, which I think is poison, basically. So that's like another battlefield here, like the frontier of how food production and what are we putting in our bodies, and the pharmaceutical industry, and what are we consuming as medicine. So maybe it's death or the powers that decide on who lives and who dies, and the mechanisms of that administration of death may be looking different. So I would just say maybe we need to think about more broadly about that.
Other question?
Thank you so much for the work that both of you have done. If the issue around the margins is so important, and the margins are so fragmented, partly because there's not a collective sense of identity, I'm wondering, what does today, these moments, require of us, given that?
Well, I mean, I don't know, go ahead.
I think that's probably a question most of us wake up asking ourselves, right? Because what is the margin gets changed all the time. I guess more and more people join it, but I think...
And is it the margin? Like, if we're all in it, is it the margin?
Yes, exactly. Is it still the margin? But I think it requires a kind of collectivity. And there are moments in the news where we can take certain lessons, right? For example, the Amazon is burning. And does that concern us? You know, we talk about that as the lung of the world. But you see a lot on social media, but it's still distance. And I think when we come together is sadly when people, like when we feel like when we'll have that sudden collectivity is when people feel like, oh, the majority of us are concerned, this affects me, this affects my child. And there's still, I think, that thing where we feel like, today it might affect my child, but tomorrow it affects your child. But if we all kind of see ourselves as maybe the broadest collectivity possible, and we found a common thread, which one would think would be the environment, for example, right? The fact that we need air, we all need air to breathe. Like if we start there, but we can't even get there. So I think once we have a kind of sense of like collective peril, maybe, religious people have that, right? And that's what, like, in church that holds them together in certain things. So I think there are like collective griefs when certain celebrities die, you know. So maybe there are lessons for us in these moments, like when perhaps it's collective peril that will lead to collective action.
I have a thought. I mean, when the austerity debt crisis in Puerto Rico became news, I was invited by a lot of student groups to explain, and I found myself ending up like saying, this is so, like a chart in the board, like, so there's this and there's this, and then I see the faces of the kids. They wanted to do something right now and they wanted to be inspired, yet I was giving them such a complicated picture of everything that they felt overwhelmed. So how I figured a way out of that was just to say, well, you see this complexity, what it means, the good news about it is that almost any step you take is a contribution. Because it's not, so there are issues you're concerned about issues of citizenship, unequal citizenship, you're concerned about democracy, you're concerned about racism, you're concerned, I mean, you name it. So what I encourage then, I improve my presentation to encourage rather than discourage, so be overwhelmed by the complexity and the too many problems. To identify within yourself what is it that moves you to action. What is it? Because in each of us, I mean, there's endless things that we can devote ourselves to, but there's things that burn particularly, burn more within us. To identify that and take a step that then creates community around that, and in that process, you are going to start linking that to other things. And as we continue to do that work of linking, we start connecting to others, and that's how we also share joy, right? Because when you have a victory on immigration, let's say Puerto Ricans are US citizens by birth, so we don't have technically an immigration issue, but I feel joy for that, tremendous joy for that. Or where there's a victory on any issue that might not be particular to what I work on, I have a bridge to that joy because I see it as moving us all forward. So I would see my short recommendation.
Well, for Renee, with Toni Morrison, yesterday we watched the film about her, The Pieces I Am. And one of the things she said when she was an editor at Random House, she's like, I couldn't march, but I could start where I was. Like, yes. So I think another piece of great advice is start where you are. Yeah. You know?
Both of you have a very large body of work that has deep cultural content. At times folkloric, at times highly mythological. But you're definitely on the hook as purveyors of contemporary cultural mythology and maybe sanity, so to speak. So in a current world where race, ethnicity, sexuality has been weaponized aggressively, could you share with us how you feel on getting drawn into this dogfight, into this battlefield, so to speak, and what goes through your mind? Are you playing defense, offense, diplomacy, strategies?
I don't know. I feel like being born in this body, I was born in the fight. part of it is the work is part of it, and it's, just being an artist doesn't, I don't know, at least in the culture I grew up in a culture where artists were killed, you don't get to check out, there's no ivory tower, so you just go where you're needed. And it's hard, because people close to you are actually living the real consequences of these. It's not a debate, there are actions that affect people you love, and so you're also doing, you're going down to the immigration service to get the papers, you're writing letters that affects a particular people's lives, and so you're living it within your circle, your intimate circle. So it's not, it doesn't feel in a way it just feels like a continual thing that you're living in the world. I don't think it's like, today I'm going to play defense, I'm going to play offense. You just are living your life, and your life just happens to have to involve all of these things.
Well, because power is not in one location that just seize it, take it, or whatever. It's at every level of our being and our social space. I think we need all the strategies, and those are going to be determined by whoever is situated, whatever groups are situated in certain ways. Personally, I feel that I ended up in this juncture in particular doing art. This is actually my first art project, right? I've made films before, but the experience of film is entirely different. I feel like, you make a film, people come to the theater, I don't know, something might happen inside, but you don't really see that for the most part. Whereas with this project, you put an object in a public space and you make up a currency and people all of a sudden are using it. You've altered that space in ways that you can see it in real time. It's a very different experience. But the reason I think I chose that is because I felt that the environment, the vocabularies, the debates, the contours of things was so fried, was not yielding anything for me anymore, that in that juncture I felt the better move was to create. That might not be always the case. In other junctures, the move might be to step up physically, to become a physical barrier, or it might be to create a political organization. Depends. But that's where you get the diversity of perspectives, which will lead to diversity of tactics and strategies. I teach a course called Revolution in the Caribbean, and the last time I taught it, I thought it was the discussions that we had is that you can't make a revolution, and I mean revolution metaphorically right now, a transformation a radical transformation of any level, any kind, without actually the participation of various levels of society. So in that regard, I think it's not a matter of choosing there's no such thing as the best strategy or the only strategy, but multiple strategies, because power is reproduced at all spheres. So it's not located in a place you can just get it out of the box. So we're all in it. Oh, we're at 0.
Hi.
Good evening. Hi. First, I'd like to thank the both of you for all the things that you've done. And then my question is, what is your opinion on the state of education as it pertains to students of color?
Can you repeat that? Did you hear that?
The state of education as it pertains to students of color.
Oh, okay, got it. Oh, wow.
That's a big one. I don't know. I'm not in academia right now, but I have students of color at home. So, I think I can't speak to the larger thing, but I think it certainly requires vigilance, right? Especially when, for example, there was a case a couple of years ago in Texas where there was a textbook that called the slave trade like immigration or migration. I think I'm still surprised, for example, when I meet kids who, like young people who are in high school who've never heard of the Haitian Revolution. That's my particular bias, like when you're hearing the history of the world. So I think there certainly are going to be gaps, but it all depends on the school. Of course, they're wonderful. And also, the more I have, two of my brothers are black male teachers, which happens to be a rarity, it seems, in a lot of school systems. So we need more teachers of color, certainly, more administrative colors. So that's all I know about it as a parent and as a sister of teachers. And supplemental programs, certainly, I think like a more inclusive type of curriculum.
Well, as an educator, I mean, although I disidentify with that term, but I think we have a school emergency at so many levels. First, the state of public education in this country. The ways that education is funded to reproduce inequality. From what's being taught in schools, which is still, you could say, a white supremacist curriculum, and so forth, right? So we, say the K through 12, we have certain types of challenges. And then when you, in a university environment, and some of those challenges don't go away. I think that the curricula of most universities is actually not that different in some ways, but presents, in some cases, opportunities. So what in that front, what I'm working on at the university level is what can we do to pretty much provide at least an alternative to the ways that teaching itself is conceived, from people who know to people that don't know, to teaching what every human should know in the United States, that's 99% white American and European thought, for instance. So I would say that if that's a burning issue for you, there's so much to do. So start somewhere, because everything from who has access to education, what is that education, and that affects not only students, it affects faculty, for instance, the kind of teachers that you have. If you look at the demographics of higher education, you see that the vast majority of people that are teaching you are not people of color, for instance. And in addition to that, it's not only that there's no people of color, also that the perspectives that you are getting also come from very limited part of human history. So anyway, yeah.
Oh, no, I was going to say, are you interested in teaching?
I think that also a paradigm of teaching itself, being in a classroom, taking notes, emptying that in an exam, it's obsolete. I think we need a model that understands that teaching is going both ways and outside of the academy, that there's knowledge that is not getting in, that we have to exchange that knowledge to create other worlds. So I think there's just a lot of work to do in education, and it's part and parcel of the political issues that you were bringing up earlier.
Mm-hmm. And we need more people like you who are already somewhat aware of the inequalities, right? I'm recruiting a teacher.
Yes.
Well, sorry, yes, another question. Yeah, great, please.
There's 2 questions there.
2 more, yeah, sure.
Good evening. I have a question for Ms. Danticat, but first I would like to thank you both for your work. So, Ms. Danticat, I'm in the midst of reading The Farming of Bones. I started a few days ago, and I was reading it. I was very enticed with the imagery you brought in the book. So my questions are, what personal experiences did you have with the book? And what advice would you give to upcoming writers and authors?
The book, The Farming of Bones, is about a massacre of Haitians in the Dominican Republic in 1937. So when I was growing up in Haiti, I had family members who would go and work in the Dominican Republic in cane work. And often when they came back, they were, they were afraid to come back because they didn't really come back. They didn't have much to come back with, but those who did come back were very sick and basically often came back to die. And so they would talk about this thing called the couteau, it's like the cut. And so that's how I became aware of that this massacre had happened. And then I realized nobody really talked about it. And I went to the border where it's supposedly to have happened. And then I was talking to some of the people who survived, who are now on the other side of the border, and they said it was like working the cane was like working the land to grow bones. So then that's where the title of the book was called The Farming of Bones, and I did this research and wrote about it. Advice for young writers: just write, just do it. It's and don't put it off. Like, I'll do it when I'm 16. I'll do it when I'm, just do it. Like, if you write a page a day, at the end of the year, you'll have 365 pages. And if it's what you want to do. Like, even I didn't tell anybody when I was in high school that I was writing, except these particular people who I would write these things and give to. It was my secret. So even if you're doing it that way, just keep doing it.
As a socially engaged artist, you're sort of occupying this space that requires a lot of emotional labor from you, especially because you're working with communities or seeking to represent communities in your work. So I was curious to see sort of how do you work through this emotional labor? And what the strategies you use to push yourself while still keeping yourself sane while you're doing the art that you're doing?
I think what gets me through a lot of the work that I do, whether it's writing or art or film, for instance, I have a film that's about World War II in the island of Guam, where the population was subject to a massacre during the end of World War II. And I think what gets me through those moments is a sense of that there needs to be justice. And there needs to be joy, right? So I think the way that you balance that, you just find those moments of, in the process, whether it's the actual process of doing or writing, or it's in the stories that you hear, but mostly in the people that you meet and what you interact with that gives you joy. And that pain or that draining feelings that you might have, ultimately when you connect to other people and you share those, it feels less of a burden. And it feels like you're actually contributing to addressing in some way that unrecognized injustice and perhaps contributing in some small way to that goal. So I would say that's, to me, connecting to other people is and sharing is what gets me through what at some points might feel draining or exhausting.
I always think of the people who came before me. Like when I was writing that book, for example, The Farming of Bones, I would cry constantly when I was writing it. And I kept thinking, like, I'm writing about one person, and no matter what I write, it's never going to be as horrific as it was for the people who lived that. So I think of the people who came before me, I think of all that they went through, and I think that I am the realization of their dream. Like when they were thinking of like how this might end well, they thought of the future like that. And so that for me feels like no matter what it is I'm feeling, it pales in comparison to what came before. So that also encourages me.
Also, I think the question of the work of remembrance, despite the horror, that's not forgotten. And that those lives have value. Whatever they went through, however they were treated or challenged, that in this process we honor them. And I think that's another part of the process that even when you cry through it all, gets you through.
Well, thank you. You honor us both by being here. Let's give it up for Frances Negrón. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.